signs you're too closed-minded and why it's holding you back. Let's begin with a question that might hit deeper than you expect. What if the biggest obstacle in your life right now isn't your circumstances, your past, or even other people, but the way you think? It sounds harsh, maybe even unfair. But if we're being honest, and I mean radically honest, many of us are walking through life with a closed door inside our minds. And we don't even realize it. The worst kind of closed-mindedness isn't the loud, stubborn kind we see in others. It's the quiet, subtle kind that hides in our habits, our assumptions, and our certainty. It's the part of us that says, "I already know." And that single phrase, that little reflex of confidence, can be the very thing stopping us from growing. Now imagine this: someone offers you a key to a new perspective, a new idea, a new version of yourself. But because it doesn't match what you already believe or how you already live, you reject it without even exploring it. That's what being closed-minded does. It makes us defend who we are instead of becoming who we could be. And that's the tragedy, because the truth is, most of us are afraid of being wrong. Not because we love truth, but because we tie our identity to our beliefs. We think, if I was wrong about this, what else might I be wrong about? That unraveling is scary, but it's also necessary. Growth always begins where certainty ends.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries. Socrates famously said, "I know that I know nothing." Not because he was ignorant, but because he understood that wisdom begins with humility. But a closed mind says, "I've arrived." An open mind says, "I'm still on the way." And here's the twist: being open-minded doesn't mean you believe everything. It means you're willing to question everything. It means you value truth over comfort, understanding over validation. That's rare, but it's also powerful. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. When was the last time you genuinely changed your mind about something important? Not just a preference, but a belief, a worldview, a value. If it's been a while, that's worth paying attention to. Because if your beliefs never change, either you've already reached ultimate truth or you've stopped listening. And let's be real, none of us have reached ultimate truth. We're all somewhere in the middle of the mountain, climbing, stumbling, learning. The danger is pretending we're already at the top. Closed-mindedness shows up in sneaky ways. It's not just about politics or religion or science. It's about how we respond to feedback, to discomfort, to unfamiliarity. When someone challenges us, do we get curious or do we get defensive? When we hear a new idea, do we explore it or dismiss it? When life throws us something unexpected, do we adapt or cling to what we know? These reactions reveal everything. Because the mind, just like a muscle, only gets stronger when it's stretched. But here's where it gets even more profound. Being closed-minded doesn't just block new ideas, it blocks connection. When we refuse to consider other perspectives, we isolate ourselves in echo chambers. We stop learning from people who are different. We stop growing through conversation. And worst of all, we start mistaking agreement for truth. But truth doesn't care if it's popular. It doesn't bend to fit our comfort zones, it exists beyond them. And the only way to reach it is to leave the safety of certainty. There's a deep philosophical principle here. The more rigid our minds, the more fragile our identities. Think about that. If your sense of self can't handle being challenged, it's not strong, it's brittle. Real strength comes from flexibility, from being able to hold opposing ideas in tension, from being able to say, I was wrong, not as a defeat, but as a victory of wisdom over ego. So ask yourself this: what beliefs are you holding on to not because they're true, but because they're familiar? What ideas make you uncomfortable and why? Is it possible that your resistance isn't to the idea itself, but to what it might mean about you? That's the shadow side of a closed mind. It protects the ego at the expense of the soul. But the soul doesn't want safety, it wants truth. And sometimes, truth feels like destruction before it feels like liberation. If you're feeling a little called out right now, good. Well, that discomfort, that's the door. Because awareness is the first crack in the armor. And through that crack, light can enter. But this isn't about shame, it's about opportunity. Because the moment you realize you've been closed-minded is the moment you open yourself to growth. And that shift, that willingness to question, to listen, to evolve, that's where transformation begins. The mirror of resistance. Why the things you reject reveal what you fear most. It's easy to think of closed-mindedness as a matter of intellect, like it's just about refusing to accept logical arguments or scientific evidence. But what if it's much deeper than that? What if being closed-minded isn't a flaw in our thinking, but a fear embedded in our being? What if the things we instantly reject, the people we instinctively judge, the ideas we stubbornly avoid are actually mirrors, reflecting the parts of ourselves we're not ready to confront? This is where the conversation shifts from the mental to the existential. Because resistance is rarely about the thing itself. It's about what the thing represents. Let's go deeper. Imagine someone brings up a worldview that completely contradicts yours. Maybe it's political, spiritual, cultural. And your immediate reaction is to dismiss it. Not after careful thought, but instantly with emotion. Why? Most of us would say, because it's wrong. But that's not the full story. The more honest answer might be, because it threatens something I'm attached to. See, our resistance often points not to external threats, but to internal insecurities. It exposes what we've built our identity on. And when something shakes those foundations, we don't analyze, we defend. But what if those moments of resistance are actually invitations? Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That's a hard truth to swallow. Because it means the things that trigger us the most, the things we find unbearable in others, might be connected to the parts of ourselves we haven't made peace with. The person we call arrogant might reflect our own unacknowledged pride. The belief we scoff at might point to our own fear of being misled. And the lifestyle we judge might be one we secretly desire but feel unworthy of. Resistance, then, becomes a kind of philosophical compass pointing us not away from truth, but toward it, if we're brave enough to follow it. Here's something to consider. What if every time you rejected something without reflection, you missed a chance to learn something essential about yourself? What if your strongest no is actually a disguise, maybe something that scares you because it challenges who you think you are? That's where real growth happens. Not in the comfort of agreement, but in the discomfort of contradiction. The edge of resistance is the edge of evolution. And this isn't just about big ideas. It's about small, everyday choices. The friend you avoid because they see through you. The book you won't read because it makes you question your beliefs. The silence you run from because it forces you to hear your own thoughts. In each of these moments, there's a deeper layer, a reason beneath the reason. And if we dig, if we really sit with that discomfort instead of escaping it, we often find that what we fear is not being wrong but being changed. Being closed-minded, then, is not merely stubbornness. It's self-protection. But protection from what? From the vulnerability that comes with transformation, and from the humility of realizing our current worldview might be incomplete, and from the responsibility that comes with seeing more clearly. And yet, paradoxically, that's where the power is. Because the moment we stop resisting, we start expanding. We don't lose ourselves, we find a deeper version of ourselves, one that isn't afraid of being wrong, because it understands that truth isn't static. It's a journey. So let me ask you a question that might stay with you longer than you expect. What are you resisting right now? And what might that resistance be trying to teach you? Could it be that the very idea you're avoiding is the doorway to your next breakthrough? Could it be that the person you've labeled as wrong is carrying a piece of wisdom you need? If you're willing to look into that mirror, not with judgment but with curiosity, you might discover that the things you've been rejecting are actually the missing pieces of your own puzzle. That's the irony of resistance. It feels like strength, but it often reveals the places we are most fragile. And in facing those fragile places, in opening to what we once closed off, we stop fearing change. We start embracing it. And in doing so, we step into a version of ourselves that is not just more open, but more whole. The cost of certainty, how the need to be right destroys growth. There's something deeply seductive about being right. It gives us a sense of control, of safety, of superiority. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, certainty becomes a kind of armor. It tells us we're on the right side, thinking the right thoughts, living the right way. But what if that very need to be right is the thing that's holding us back the most? What if certainty, instead of being a sign of strength, is actually a symptom of fear? When we cling to being right, we unconsciously close the door to growth, because growth requires that we admit we don't know everything. Certainty is comfortable, but comfort rarely leads to transformation. The people who evolve the most, the thinkers, the artists, the philosophers, the leaders, are not the ones who insist they've figured it out, but the ones who stay open to being reshaped. They understand that the world is vast, complex, filled with nuance, and they approach it with humility, not arrogance. The need to be right turns curiosity into conflict. It makes discussion feel like debate and learning feel like losing. It frames every disagreement as a threat rather than an opportunity to deepen our understanding. Think about the last time you argued with someone, not just debated ideas, but truly argued, with emotion and ego involved. Was your goal to understand them? Or was it to win? To prove your point? That impulse to win, to dominate intellectually, is a form of psychological self-defense. But what are we defending? It's rarely the idea itself. More often, it's our identity, the version of ourselves we've built around those ideas. And that's the root of the problem. When our beliefs become our identity, any challenge to them feels like a personal attack. So we dig in, we double down. Even when we're wrong, we fight to be right. But here's the hard truth: being right is not the same as being wise. Wisdom requires flexibility. It requires a willingness to change, not just opinions, but perspectives. And that means we have to let go of the illusion that we've arrived. Certainty stops the journey. It says, "I've made it," when in reality, we've only just begun. And the more certain we become, the less we listen, the less we observe, the less we grow. This isn't just a philosophical issue, it's a practical one. In relationships, the need to be right creates distance. It builds walls where there should be bridges. It turns love into power struggles and collaboration into competition. In careers, it stifles innovation. People who are too certain resist feedback, ignore new ideas, and eventually become obsolete. In personal development, it halts progress. Because if you already believe you're right about everything, there's no room for improvement. So let's flip the script. What if being wrong isn't shameful, but essential? What if every time you realize you were mistaken, you're actually leveling up? That moment of disillusionment, painful as it is the birthplace of insight. It's the shedding of an old skin. And yes, it hurts. But after the sting fades, what's left is clarity. And clarity is worth the discomfort. Ask yourself this: where in your life are you clinging to being right? And what might you gain if you let go of that need? Could it be that the very thing you're trying to prove is the thing you most need to question? Could it be that the people you dismiss as wrong are showing you blind spots you've never considered? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because the cost of certainty is not just intellectual, it's spiritual. It limits who we can become. To truly grow, we have to make peace with uncertainty. We have to hold our beliefs loosely, not because they don't matter, but because we matter more. Our evolution as human beings depends not on being right, but on being real. And the realest thing we can admit is that we don't have it all figured out, and we never will. But in that admission, ironically, is where real wisdom begins. The power of openness, how a flexible mind creates an unstoppable life. If there's one truth that quietly governs everything we've explored so far, it's this: the mind that stays open is the mind that never stops growing. Openness isn't weakness, it's the highest form of strength, because it allows us to engage with the world without fear of being shattered by it. A flexible mind, like a strong tree in the wind, bends without breaking. It adapts, absorbs, reflects, and transforms. And in a world that is constantly shifting socially, technologically, emotionally, our ability to stay open is no longer a luxury. It's a necessity. When we talk about being open-minded, it's easy to imagine someone who just agrees with everything or never takes a stand. But that's not openness, that's passivity. True openness has boundaries, but those boundaries are shaped by understanding, not ego. It's the ability to hold competing ideas in tension without collapsing, to listen without immediately judging, and to question without immediately rejecting, and perhaps most importantly, to change without losing ourselves in the process. Openness is not the absence of conviction, it's the presence of deep curiosity. In practical terms, this kind of openness creates a life that's remarkably resilient. You become less reactive and more reflective. You stop needing to control every outcome because you trust yourself to navigate whatever comes. You become comfortable with not knowing, and in that space of uncertainty, you discover insights that the rigid mind will always miss. Openness lets you see beyond the surface of people, of events, of yourself. It makes you a better learner, a better communicator, a better human. Because you're not filtering reality through the narrow lens of how things should be. You're engaging with it as it is. And here's something even deeper: the more open you are, the more life begins to open back up to you. You start noticing opportunities you used to overlook. You hear truth in places you once ignored. You feel connected in ways that don't require agreement, only presence. Openness doesn't just change how you think, it changes what you see. It invites in new relationships, new ideas, and new dimensions of experience that were always there, waiting behind the wall of certainty. But perhaps the most powerful result of openness is this: it creates freedom. Not the kind of freedom that's about doing whatever you want, but the kind that comes from not being trapped by your own mind. You're no longer imprisoned by the need to be right or the fear of being wrong. You're not held hostage by your past beliefs or outdated versions of yourself. You can evolve, you can grow, you can become someone new, not through force, but through willingness. That kind of life, fluid, resilient, awake, is unstoppable. Not because it avoids difficulty, but because it transforms difficulty into insight. Not because it always has the answers, but because it never stops asking better questions. And the greatest question of all, the one that sits quietly at the heart of every open mind, is what else might be true? If you can live with that question, if you can carry it through your relationships, your work, your growth, you'll find that the world becomes less of a battlefield and more of a classroom, less of a threat and more of a dialogue. So ask yourself one last time, where have I closed the door out of fear? Where have I mistaken comfort for truth? And what might happen if I open back up, not recklessly, but courageously? Because in that opening there is light. In that flexibility there is strength. And in that willingness to change, there is an entirely new life waiting to unfold. The journey of becoming is never finished. But the more open we are, the more beautiful it becomes. Not because we control it, but because we learn to dance with it. In the end, the most open minds don't just understand the world better, they live in it more fully. They breathe deeper, they love harder, and they grow endlessly. And maybe that's the final sign of true wisdom, not that we know everything, but that we never stop being willing to learn.